Uh, Thanks, Noel. Good evening, everybody. It's great to be back in Glanties. I haven't been a very regular visitor here over recent years, but in the days when I was involved in the Irish Times, Joe and the committee were kind enough to have Anne and myself here on a number of occasions, and it's great to be back. And I have to say, everybody is looking younger and better and healthier. We're here to talk this evening about serious issues, but it is customary to start with a joke. There aren't very many jokes that you can make about the Guards nowadays, but there's one told by a man called Larry Wren, who was ended up as Garda Commissioner. Larry was Chief Superintendent here in Donegal for a long time, but Larry used to tell with some relish the story of as a young guard in Cork. Part of his job was to visit the schools. So we went into this school in this particularly tough part of Cork, and the teacher said to him, "The kids here, they're great at English. They really love to do composition. So why don't you get them to do a competition?" Larry says, on the Guards. And I'm going to come around here next Tuesday or Wednesday, and I have a little box of sweets, he said, for the best essay. So he came around the following Tuesday, and all the kids had their essays done in the Guards, and the essays some of them were long, some of them were short, and the shortest one just simply said, "The Guards is all bastards." So this was a challenge to Larry's psychology. So Larry said, "I'm going to award the box of sweets to the fellow who wrote that." So he handed him the box of sweets, and he says, "No," he says, "what do you say?" And the man turns around and he says, "The Guards is cunning bastards." Anyway, to more serious matters. Law and justice, openness, transparency and accountability required. It was a distinguished British barrister and international human rights campaigner and a long-serving Labour MP at Westminster by the name of Ben Whittaker, who said that one of the best tests of a country's democratic health is the way its police do their job. Ben died just last month, aged 80 years of age. I realised as I read his obituary that he had actually come to Dublin 35 years ago and at a public meeting urged the establishment of an independent police authority for the Garda Síochána. The police, Whittaker maintained, are always a perfect microcosm of society's shared values. Their standards are those of the mainstream from which they are drawn. They embody and they uphold establishment values. Another distinguished police sociologist, the American George Moss, added perceptively that while armies have often led revolutions in countries, history cannot give us a single instance of a revolution being led by a police force. Whittaker added an interesting metaphor to his work on the police in describing the custodians of law and order in the tradition that he was most familiar with, which was the British English constabulary tradition. He likened it to a flock of sheep who decide to ask a number of their fellows to dress up as sheepdogs. And the role of the sheepdogs, even though they are only sheep, but the role of the supposed sheepdogs is to protect the flock, but also to regulate the flock. And when they do so overzealously, or perhaps inefficiently, the other sheep can turn around and say, "Well, actually, you're not a sheepdog at all, you're only a sheep. You're dressed up like a sheepdog, and you're dressed up like a sheepdog with the powers of a sheepdog because we've given them to you." And that's what's known as the principle of policing by consent. So when we look at our police, the way they do their work, the priorities which we assign to them, and the standards that they embody, we are invariably looking at the standards and the values of our wider society. If society tolerates physical brutality or sexual abuse, so will the police. If society operates on the principle of the nod and the wink and the blind eye, so will the police. If society accepts corruption in business or politics, these too will be reflected in the police. And this is as true in Ireland as it has been from Los Angeles to London, as it has been from 1930s Germany to the deep south of the United States in the racist 1960s. So how are we doing here? Openness, transparency, and accountability are required in the operation of our police. That's what the programme says. I doubt there's anybody in the room here who disagrees with that. But we also require other things of our police. We require the protection of our democracy. We require the confrontation of financial and corporate corruption. We require safety on our streets and in our homes. We require protection from violent antisocial behaviour. We require order in our public places and safety in our roads. We require our children to be protected from drugs, from sexual exploitation, from cyber predators and from random violence. And I don't think there's anybody in the room who would disagree with any of that as the role for our police either. So the task that we entrust to our police, the guardians of the people's peace, the Garda Síochána, is considerable. It's challenging and it is at times dangerous. We asked a routinely unarmed police force to hold the line for 30 years from the early 1970s in this state against an armed conspiracy whose aim was to bring down that state. 15 guards died in the line of duty over that period. We asked them to deal with a criminal class involved principally in the drugs trade that is as ruthless and as well organised and as well armed as any in Western Europe. Our crime rates are low in the overall, but in parts of Dublin and for a time in parts of Limerick, the rate of murder by shooting was higher than anywhere else in these islands. We ask our police to maintain public order among a young population that is close to the top when it comes to drugs consumption across the European Union. I think too often we lose sight of the complexity and the dangers of the task which we ask our police force to undertake. We give them considerable powers and immunities in order to enable them to discharge these functions. And we have incrementally increased these powers over the years to the point that would have been really unthinkable to legal practitioners, judges, and indeed even the Gardaí themselves perhaps a decade ago. Police forces everywhere always maintain that their powers are inadequate. And for decades that was true here. We gave the Gardaí extraordinary powers to deal with subversion and the IRA, but we rather limited their powers in dealing with ordinary non-subversive crime. All that, however, has changed, and I don't think it is widely apprehended that in a series of criminal justice acts passed by the Oireachtas between 2006 and 2009, we actually gave the Gardaí virtually all of the powers in relation to ordinary crime that they have had down the decades for dealing with subversive crime. Between three criminal justice acts, 2006, 7 and 9, the full range of powers that had been fashioned by the state to deal with subversion were given to the guards to be used against ordinary crime. Membership of or helping to direct a criminal gang became an offence, for example. Jury trials with all of their vulnerabilities were a thing of the past, as we saw with the conviction of Wayne Dundon during the week. The ordinary criminals could now be dealt with by the Special Criminal Court in the manner of the IRA and other subversives of previous decades. Under the Surveillance Acts, the Guards, the Defence Forces and the Revenue were given the authority to bug houses, break into houses and premises, vehicles, and to engage in electronic monitoring and to gather evidence that way which can then be produced in court. In parallel with this development of police powers, and it has been very considerable, we have built in some safeguards as we began to accept that for all the good work that is done by the Garda Síochána, there has also been abuses. I don't think it has actually worked all that well. Crises in the Gardaí have been cyclical, arising each decade. The heavy gang and the fingerprint scandals in the 1970s, illegal phone tapping in the 80s, the Kerry babies in the 80s, Donegal in the 90s, Kieran Boylan in the 2000s, and now phone tapping whistleblower allegations, penalty points abuses and so on. Successive governments, I would suggest, have applied remedies on an ad hoc basis, usually after some form of inquiry. We had the Barrow O'Brien inquiry, for example. Then we had the regulation for the treatment of persons in custody, the Garda Complaints Board, and then in Michael's 2005 Act, the Garda Síochána Ombudsman Commission and the Garda Inspectorate. I would suggest that probably what we have done along the way, although well-intentioned, has been too little and too late. The core issue, I would suggest, has been the unwillingness on the part of the political establishment and the administrative establishment, and particularly the Department of Justice, to cede any control over the state's police apparatus. It's as if they've wanted to have a veneer of public accountability while retaining the essence of political control. The great sociologist of early policing was a man called Charles Reith. And he has identified two distinct models of policing in the Western world. He called them the police of the prince and the police of the people. And they can perhaps be described as the constabulary model and the gendarmerie model. The constabulary is generally locally controlled, routinely unarmed, and lives among the community. The gendarmerie is controlled by central government, frequently armed, frequently lives in barracks or other official quarters. The Garda Síochána we established in 1922 here was a hybrid. It was to have the strengths of the gendarmerie, the RIC, upon which it was modelled, while at the same time it was going to have the more civilising outward appearances, if you like, of the English constabulary, blue uniforms, unarmed, a rank system borrowed from rural England. And we ended up, as I say, with a hybrid. The Garda Síochána was brought into existence to discharge two functions: to be a civil police and at the same time to be the state's frontline security service. That is rare. There is only one other country in Western Europe, and that is Norway, which has the same model. There is a separation between the security service and the policing service. So the Commissioner of the Garda Síochána is not just the head of the civil police force. He or she is also the head of national security. Your local superintendent or chief is not just your local police manager. He or she is also the state's security representative in the area. In this respect, the Garda Síochána is much closer to being the police of the prince, the police of central government, than being the police of the people. This duality has suited a great many interests down the decades. It suited the politicians who saw the Gardaí as a rich source of patronage in promotion or preferment. It was always easy to deliver favours for constituents when the local sergeant or the district superintendent believed that he would require his TD's support for promotion. It suited the civil servants who controlled a state where there was a wide network of willing and obedient agents. And it suited the Gardaí, who were frequently very happy to see themselves linked into the state's structure of power and privilege. It has not suited the individuals who haven't had insider connections. It has not suited the vulnerable or the young men prone to crime, or young people who've fallen foul of people, of those in power. And it hasn't suited those Gardaí who don't have political connections and who have believed that their role was to enforce the law impartially. It doesn't suit a society anymore that has moved on from the Civil War situation in which central government effectively needed a garrison in every town and village. So what needs to be done? I think the question is, do we want a police of the prince or do we want a police of the people? Do we want a police that serves the needs of the community and not merely the demands of central government? Do we want a police that can be manipulated through promotion, by preferment, by politicians? Or do we want one where it's genuinely independent in the service that it provides to all members of the public? Much of the solution would appear to be contained, at least potentially, in the heads of bill of the Garda Síochána Amendment Act 2014, presented by Francis Fitzgerald and accepted by government. We have the promise of an independent Garda authority, enhanced powers for GSOC, and a promise that the Garda Commissioner of the future will be appointed independently. The devil, as always, is going to be in the detail. We don't know yet how the Independent Garda Authority will be constituted or what its powers will be. We do not know how the process of appointing a new commissioner will operate, and we do not know what the relationship will be between the authority and the commissioner. But I have a doubt, putting it mildly, that the Department of Justice will relinquish the authority that it has over the commissioner, authority that was broadened and actually put on a statutory footing in the 2005 Act. I have a doubt that the remit of the new authority will extend to issues of state security, and the invocation of state security has always been the great escape clause for the covering up of Garda misconduct. If we end up with a Garda authority whose remit is limited to community relations, road traffic regulations and the policing of public events, we will simply perpetuate the cycle of political manipulation and stifling civil service control. I do not doubt the Minister's good intentions, no more than I ever doubted Michael McDowell's good intentions, but getting politics out of policing and getting policing out of politics is a lot easier said than done. If we want a police of the people, we have to persuade the Prince, along with the courtiers and the mandarins, not necessarily to surrender all of their power and authority, but to make it genuinely and fully amenable to oversight and invigilation. I believe it when I see it. We will get the police and the policing at the standards that the political and administrative establishment is prepared to pay for. If they're prepared to pay for it, not so much in treasure or in money, as in their willingness, genuinely and honestly, to relinquish the power of patronage and influence. As I said, I believe it when I see it. Thank you.